Thanks, Ronan. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for turning up. I suppose first of all, I'd like to thank. There's only 9 slides. I'll just go back. I don't want people to be obsessed with looking at this ballot and Bertie Ahern. We've seen enough of him for the last while. So I just want to thank Ronan, obviously, and the Australian Ireland Institute and the Centre for Global Irish Studies for this opportunity to speak tonight. As Ronan said, as I'm sure you're all aware, Ireland has been going through, I suppose, a bit of a crisis in the last couple of years. And this led to a crisis, I suppose, economically, but this has led to a much wider and deeper thinking about really the whole purpose of our institutions. And so the government, the outgoing government a couple of years ago, the Fianna Fáil Green Party coalition, they set up a committee to explore the idea about are the Irish institutions fit for purpose? And so they basically began a whole debate about political reform. They looked at everything. They said, well, what's the point of having an upper house? What's the point of having a president, which Ronan referred to? What's the point of having this preferential system? And such was the nature of the crisis. They even called in academics like myself, and basically every political scientist in Ireland at one stage appeared before parliamentary committees in the last 2 years, just to give their opinion on the various comparative experience. So this is kind of what I'm interested in, because politicians grew obsessed with, we have to change everything. We have to adopt a new voting system. The current Taoiseach has pledged to abolish our upper house. He's pledged to reform the presidential system in terms of the nomination process and so on, without actually looking at, well, what actual change will come about. We might change the system, but is that really going to lead to anything different? So that's really kind of the overall theme I'm interested in tonight. Why do I want to speak about electoral systems? As Ronan said, it does tend to, it unfortunately does often just attract the ANRAC community. And I'll just highlight an example of sometimes why it can confuse people, and unfortunately so, because it is a really crucial aspect of democracy. Because if you talk about democracies, you talk about electoral democracies. I mean, as Joseph Schumpeter, the author of the famous work Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, said, the only real thing that most citizens do in any democracy is vote. If you take away the voting, what actual participation is taking part in democracy? So that's really why it's crucial to understand what happens when you actually cast your ballot. What goes on in the meantime when we actually have people elected after all these ballots have been counted. So I'll just begin with the story from Venice. So in Venice, the Doge was the leader of the Venetian Republic for over 1,000 years, up until its collapse at the end of the 17th century. But unlike his ruling contemporaries across Europe, the Doge was not selected because of birthright, bribery, or warmongering skills. Rather, the Doge was actually an elected position for almost 500 years. Now, this Doge wasn't elected, as is the case, by preferential voting, as is in Ireland and Australia. The way the process worked was, initially, the entire electorate came together, and from the electorate, 30 members were picked. Then from this 30, a further 9 were picked by lottery. Then these 9 people then nominated 40 candidates, which was again reduced by lottery to 12. These 12 then nominated 25. I'm only halfway there. These 25 were reduced to 9 by lottery. This group of 9 then picked an electoral college of 45. Following a further lottery, the 45 became 11, who then chose the final college of 41. Now, each member of this college of 41 proposed 1 candidate, and each elector cast a vote for every candidate of whom he approved. The candidate with the most approvals was the winner, provided he had been endorsed by at least 25 of the 41. If not, they started again from scratch. Now, the aim of this method was not, was really to prevent backroom deals and to lessen the influence of powerful families. But the real point of this example, as is obvious, is to show you how complex and arcane electoral systems can be. However, as I argue in this presentation, debate over the choice of electoral rules should not be the preserve of Jonathan Swift's Laputians from Gulliver's Travels, the academic-minded people who literally lived with their heads in the clouds. Rather, the method of voting is a crucial aspect of any democracy. As an infamous non-advocate of democracy, Joseph Stalin, once remarked, "You know, comrades, that I think in regard to this, I consider it completely unimportant who in the party will vote, or how. But what is extraordinarily important is this: who will count the votes and how? So this evening I'm going to talk to you about an electoral system that has a long history in both Ireland and Australia, a system that is used to elect only one other parliament, the Maltese. This system is the Single Transferable Vote. Now, the field of Irish studies covers a vast array of Irish success stories in literature, music and history that have inspired many across the world. It may surprise some of you to hear that in the field of elections and related studies, so too many practitioners and experts look to Ireland for advice and inspiration. This is because whenever electoral reform is considered at any level, be it for elections to a club, to local elections, to national elections, different types of electoral systems are assessed for their suitability. As a voter-friendly system, the STV, the Single Transferable Vote, is almost always considered. And when looking to evaluate its experience, the eyes of reformers are always drawn to Ireland. This is because, as I said, it's one of only a couple of houses in the world that uses this system to elect its members. Now, only one other lower house of Parliament, the Maltese, uses it. The house in Australia is the upper house. So when people look at the lower houses, they usually ignore Malta because of its size. So therefore, Ireland gains a lot of attention when people consider electoral reform. For this reason, whenever you read a report of a parliamentary committee on elections and electoral reform, as no doubt you do for light entertainment, or indeed any text that refers to the Single Transferable Vote, it will usually discuss what happens to a fifth preference at the seventh count in, say, the Laois-Offaly constituency at the 1977 election. Now, to the residents of Laois and Offaly, it might seem particularly humorous that their ranking of candidates is of interest to international scholars. But the reality is that Ireland is an important case to monitor how the Single Transferable Vote affects voters and its consequences for political systems. For this reason, Irish voting behaviour is perhaps much more significant than many of the electorate might perhaps realise. While it might be exaggeration at somewhat to claim the eyes of the electoral world are on Irish voters, certainly the eyes of the international psephology and political science community are. So is the topic of electoral systems important? Well, as I said, according to Comrade Stalin, it certainly is. Just ask Al Gore, who lost the 2000 presidential election in the US despite winning a majority of votes. Just ask Silvio Berlusconi, who changed the electoral system in Italy in 2005 to try and ensure his re-election, but which in hindsight led to his defeat. Just ask the people of New Zealand, who changed their system by referendum in the 1990s and are now voting again on this issue next month. Just ask the people of the United Kingdom, who voted overwhelmingly in May this year to keep their treasured first-past-the-post electoral system. Just ask the British historians, who wrote a vociferous letter to the Times campaigning against this proposed change. I'll just read a brief extract from this letter, which was signed by such distinguished individuals as Professor Richard Evans, Niall Ferguson, Lord Norton, Anthony Beaver, and so on. But this indicates the importance that they attach to electoral systems. I'll quote, "Our nation's history is deeply rooted in our parliamentary democracy, a democracy in which over centuries men and women have fought for the right to vote. The principle that each person's vote is equal, regardless of wealth, gender, race, or creed, is a principle to which generations of reformers have dedicated their lives. It is a principle upon which reform of our parliamentary democracy still stands. The referendum on May the 5th that threatens to introduce a system of alternative voting, the Australian model, threatens to break this principle. For these reasons, we urge the British people to vote." So electoral systems apparently are important because obviously they can affect the outcome of the election. They determine which candidates get to sit in Parliament, which obviously then affects the nature of public policy. This explains why twice Fianna Fáil tried to get rid of the Single Transferable Vote and introduce the British first-past-the-post system. It would have made them the permanent party of government. And it indeed explains many of the electoral reforms in Australia. For example, the only reason why Australia adopted the Single Transferable Vote for the upper house elections for the federal Senate was because Labour were trying to minimise their expected future losses at the next election in 1949. So the title of today's talk, The Discreet Charm of STV, I'm not sure how many of you are a fan of French surrealist films. It obviously borrows from the title, borrowing from Professor Michael Gallagher, who borrowed this title from the film The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. A film which, if you have seen it, is about the unexpected events that interfere with the expected outcome. In the case of the film, the outcome is a splendid dinner to which everyone looks forward. but which never happens. In the case of voting system, the outcome is the perfect voting result that no system can produce. So just a brief outline of my talk is I'll just explain how the single transferable vote works, just an outline, following which I'll explain why only Ireland and Australia went for it, and no one else. And then I'll just have a look at two particular consequences of the system, and I suppose how it has shaped the politics of both countries. It's making a noise, but I presume that's okay. Okay. So this is our ballot paper. This is the Irish ballot paper. The last couple of years, they decided for some reason to introduce photographs. Not that it seems to make a difference. You're probably wondering, are there any women in Ireland? There weren't any women. This is a ballot taken from the Dublin Central constituency, which was home of our former Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, and this is the 2002 election. We don't have an electoral commission as occurs in most countries. Elections are managed by a range of groups, ranging from the Department of the Environment to local county councils, which makes it an absolute nightmare for political scientists trying to gather information. You have to do a lot of phone calls, and eventually you get through to someone who answers the phone and tells you, well, I can't answer the question, but you know, there's an academic in Cork who really knows a lot about this topic. Maybe you can ask him. So you get around to square one. So the only instructions are, if you can make them out at the top of the ballot paper, that's the only instructions you have. There are no advertisements on television telling people how to vote. So a bit like driving, you go off and buy a car and it's printed up on the dashboard, here's how to drive, turn on the ignition and off you go. Pretty simple. You just put down 1 beside your most preferred candidate and 2 beside your second most preferred candidate and so on. Exactly like you have at the lower house elections here in Australia. The only difference is we have multi-member constituencies. So in this constituency, 4 people were elected. Okay, so what's the whole point of this system? Well, Britain, yeah?
Is it compulsory voting over there?
No, it's not. So the turnout at the last election was 72%. Average turnout, it was a bit higher because of the economic crisis. Average turnout now is about the high 60s. So about 1/3 of people. And don't forget, a lot of people are also disenfranchised.
You're saying 30% vote?
Don't vote. Don't vote. So the turnout is about 70% now, but we have no overseas voting as well. So, for example, I didn't have a vote, or Brennan didn't have a vote, or if there are any other...
Do you have to put a number in every square?
Well, again, because it's an Irish system, if you don't have to, and I know in Australia you have to, in Ireland you don't. You can cast as many preferences as you want. 1 will suffice. But if you only put a preference for 1 candidate, that can be any number, any mark. You can put down an X. You can put down 67. I've even been told by counting officers, you can actually put down any numbers you want as long as they remain in a consecutive order. So you can vote 1,105, 1,106. And there have been some candidates who have begun on 67 and got to 75. So they are quite liberal when it comes to it. They say all they want to see is that you have done some kind of order. I know over here they're quite strict. They wouldn't allow any of that. So no, it's not what they would call compulsory preferential voting. I believe in New South Wales you have to cast, I think, 15 preferences. Because I observed the last... Oh no, but for the state, yeah, for the state elections.
Sorry, would you mind reiterating? I haven't voted in Ireland for 37 years.
Okay, yeah. The only difference is that there was no place names.
Aren't there instructions?
There is at the top of the ballot paper, but that's all.
What did they say?
Yeah.
Rather myopic.
Sure. Mark 1 in the box beside the photograph of the candidate of your first choice. Mark 2 in the box beside the second choice, and so on.
So 67 and 1,000 shouldn't be applicable.
Well, if you voted 30 years ago, the turnout was about 85%. But we've only had photographs in the last 2 or 3 elections. We've only had party labels in the last 40 years. So up until before 40 years ago, it was just a list of names and no party labels. And of course, as I'm sure as you're aware, in villages, many people have the same name. I know a lot of people in my own home village. Their surname is the actual village name. For example, Jackie Healy-Ray, the independent from Kerry. That's not his name. His name is Jackie Healy, but there are several Jackie Healys in Kilgarvan. He lives in the tiny parish of Ray, so he was known as Jackie Healy-Ray, but it's not his name on his birth cert. So it could lead to a bit of confusion at elections, what it also resulted in, of course, the problem was, the reason why we have photographs is because an illiterate individual challenged the nature of the ballot and said it penalises him. And apparently, 30, 40 years ago, people who hadn't completed even primary school education, there was a significant number who couldn't read or write. So they didn't know who, let's say a Fianna Fáil voter, he didn't know who was the Fianna Fáil candidate. So I was told by a previous Fianna Fáil TD what would happen is he was given a copy of a ballot paper, not a real ballot paper, go into the polling station, he'd get his ballot paper, the real one, go into the ballot box, piece of cardboard, stick the real ballot paper in his pocket, pull out the fake ballot paper, write something down on it, put it in the box, walk out, hand the real ballot paper to a Fianna Fáil person who could read, who would then go in and, with the other ballot paper, get his real ballot paper, fold them up together, and slip them in. Apparently this was a common occurrence in that particular parish. Yeah.
You're talking about people that can't read. In Australia, my experience working inside and outside the polling booth is if you've got some impediment, with consent you can have someone help you.
Sure, yeah.
Does that apply in Ireland?
Well, see, now they have the party symbols. But I know, for example, we experimented with electronic voting, and that was a bit of an issue because they were saying if someone wasn't that tech-friendly and found it difficult to vote with the computer, there was a big problem in terms of you couldn't advise someone, you couldn't tell someone which button to press, and there was a big debate how could they be helped. So I think there are ballot papers with braille as well, for example. I'm not sure of the actual specifics. Does Ireland?
In Ireland, if you're, say, blind,
yeah,
can someone help you?
I presume they can. I don't know. I have seen, because I have a copy of this. Yeah, I have a copy of this ballot paper at home, and there is some kind of braille on it. So there is some facility. Yeah.
I don't know about Dublin. In Wicklow, in fact, in that very election, that people were allowed to have people assist them.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
They both had to give proof of identity.
Yeah. I mean, as I mentioned, like with the 67, 68, so on, they're quite flexible because we don't have compulsory voting, and they just want to. I mean, we have a big problem with even the registry of voters. That one of the main reasons why turnout has increased is largely because they've actually crossed out all the dead people. So.
You don't even have to have a photo, Mr. Adolph.
No, you don't have to. No. Well, I'm going to mention independence later on. If you're an independent, you're not allowed to use that title on the ballot paper. The parties, of course, the ballot paper is laid out by Parliament. Parliament is controlled by parties, and parties said no because they believe there's a certain bonus attached. So it can only be Naomh Splock or non-party. Naomh Splock being the Irish for independent. Interestingly, they also always like to state occupation and address because people like to know where you're from and what you do for a living. I remember there was a Sinn Féin candidate, Martin Ferris from Kerry. He first got elected in 2002. He was an unemployed fisherman. I remember I phoned him up and said, "Can you just tell me what is an unemployed fisherman? Is that someone who just can't fish very well?" He wasn't impressed. Then, of course, I researched his past and I realised maybe I shouldn't have asked him that question. I don't know if anyone know who Martin Ferris is, but yeah, he spent 17 years in jail for good money. Yeah, I am indeed. Yeah, I live to tell the tale. Okay, so I said one of the main reasons why we had this system is because essentially it's a British system, even though they don't use it themselves. People aren't sure who invented it. It was kind of invented in the mid-19th century independently. It was invented at one time in Denmark by Karl Andre. It was also invented by Thomas Hare, an English barrister. But it was taken up, the cause, by John Stuart Mill, the famous political philosopher, who became a firm advocate of the single transferable vote. And then there was this lobby group called the Proportional Representation Society in Britain, who lobbied the House of Commons quite vigorously on on this issue. They promoted the idea that, you know, up until 100 years ago, it was believed democracy should be about electing individuals, not parties. If you read, you know, like the classic works of, like, the Federalist, especially the Federalist number 10, you know, the set of political pamphlets that were written to promote the adoption of the US Constitution in the late 18th century, it was all warning about factions, because it says, if you have political parties, they interfere in the nature of the relationship between the voter and the politician, and that's just bad for democracy, because parties will only pursue their own interests. So that's why these people who are against parties say, look, well, this is why this is a good system, because you vote for candidates, not for political parties. So that's what this caused. It became quite. It's only really in recent years that, you know, recent decades, in terms of the actual evolution of democracy, that parties have become accepted. That the modern mass disciplined parties that we have come to grow and love and hate. So, for example, this system was proposed for adoption in the British House of Commons. It passed 5 times, 5 consecutive occasions, but each time the House of Lords defeated it, so eventually it died away. But they didn't mind passing it on to the various areas in the British Empire. So, for example, it was adopted in Tasmania in 1896, in South Africa in 1909, Malta in 1921, India and Burma in 1935, and Gibraltar in 1950. It was also introduced in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Hong Kong, and of course later Northern Ireland. So from its early days, it was very much clear that this system is a British system. No country outside of the British Empire used it for elections, and no other form of PR was contemplated within the realm. So clear was this pattern that by the 1980s, Arend Leipart, a distinguished political scientist, named it a law of social science that, quote, when Anglo-American countries use PR, they always choose STV. In other countries, the choice is list PR. Of course, once a political scientist makes a prediction about a law, it's going to be broken. And since then, exceptions have occurred in New Zealand, Canada, and even Britain. Now, I've mentioned how this system works. I don't want to get into the mechanics. The idea is that you're voting for a candidate. The counting of votes, as you know, revolves around the quota, which is the minimum number of votes that guarantees election. And except in the highly unlikely event that the requisite number of candidates filled all of the seats by reaching the quota on the basis of their first preferences alone, the counting process comprises a series of counts, or stages, each involving the distribution of surplus votes of a candidate whose total exceeds the quota, or if no one has reached the quota, the elimination of the lowest placed candidate, all of whose votes are redistributed. So counting continues until all the seats have been filled. So this, as I said, this is a candidate-centred system. Now contrast this with a typical European ballot. The typical European PR ballot is a party system. This is from the Hungarian Parliament. I think it's the 1998 election, if my Hungarian is up to scratch. You pick a party. You'd see all these are the names of the various parties. These are the candidates. You have no choice of the candidates. You simply mark your preferred party. You can see why, again, this is something which the believers of the direct democracy, of the classic democratic model who were against parties, did not want. So why is the STV ballot of interest? Yeah?
Do they allow independent candidates?
Well, in Hungary now, they have a two-list, they have a multi-member system, a bit like the New Zealand model. So there are single-seat constituencies, entirely separate to this. So independents cannot run on this part of the system, but they can run in the single-seat constituencies. So, but again, like most systems, if independents would have to come together to register as a party. So like in Australia, if you want to be, so there was I think, is it John Hatton? He was a former independent member of the lower house in New South Wales. He ran at the recent upper house elections. But if he voted, you would have seen he ran above the line. He got together 15 candidates. Now, he did terrible, but he had to form a John Hatton group, if you want. So where there are party-engineered systems, independents can still overcome these obstacles. But of course, they might feel they are compromising their independence by doing so. So, as I said, very few countries use this system. In fact, since World War II, only one country has actually adopted the single transferable vote. That was Estonia in 1990, a decision which had overturned after one election. And the only reason adopted was because there was a very prominent Estonian political scientist. He still is. He's based at, I think, at the University of California, Rein Tagapera. He went back home after the fall of the Cold War for a couple of years. He actually ran for presidential election. He got about 16%. I think the highest vote any political scientist has ever received in any election. But he basically told them, adopt a single transferable vote. And then he went back home, and the moment he went back to California, and they changed back to a more classical type of European system. So in summary, the single transferable vote is only used to elect a parliament that failed to prevent its state's worst economic crisis, a parliament in a very small democracy, and a parliament that is not its state's main democratic chamber. So it seems, as I said, STV is a system that nobody really wants. But that might not be the case. It's a system that the parties do not want because of the power it gives to voters, unlike this system. So it is very much a voter-oriented system. It is for this reason that the single transferable vote was the second most popular electoral system of political scientists in a recent survey. For some reason we get surveyed on what's your favourite electoral system, as opposed to what are your social attitudes, what is your diet, and so on. It has been recommended for adoption by the Citizens' Assembly in British Columbia. It has been adopted for local elections in New Zealand and Scotland. It has been used by the Northern Ireland Assembly since 1998. It has been recommended as the electoral system for the soon-to-be elected House of Lords in the UK, and it's once again an option for the people of New Zealand at the forthcoming referendum on the electoral system to elect its national parliament next month. All these proposals, though, are recent occurrences, as for over 50 years, as I said, Estonia was the only country outside of the Maltese, Irish and Australian Troika to adopt STV. And indeed, all the reformers in the aforementioned systems have looked to the Irish and Australian experience of STV for guidance. So why then were Ireland and Australia such trailblazers when it came to this system? Why were they so interested in it when few outside of these islands gave it the time of day? So why was this system adopted? Well, the nature of the circumstances in which it was adopted in both Ireland and Australia did not follow an expected pattern. And the reasons for the importance of why it was adopted is because such motives can explain the subsequent consequences of STV. As I've mentioned already, STV was a British system, and so obviously this played a major role in its adoption by the new governments in Ireland and Australia. There are also some admirable motives behind a preference for STV in Ireland, such as a desire to secure the representation of minorities, i.e. Ulster Unionists, and to prevent one group, specifically Sinn Féin, from having a hegemonic position. For example, on the day in 1918 when Sinn Féin won 69 out of 72 seats in the then 26 counties, the party finished third place at local elections in Sligo, which was using STV for the first time in Ireland. Of course, this might then lead us to ask, why was Sinn Féin so committed to STV when it would have been much better suited to the British first-past-the-post system, under which it won the landslide in 1918? The reason is due to one of those historical idiosyncrasies rather than the product of a rational decision-making process. When Lord Courtney of Penwith, president of the British PR Group, visited Dublin to promote STV in the early years of the 20th century, he convinced Arthur Griffith, president of Sinn Féin, of its merits. Such was the esteem with which Griffith was and later was held in Sinn Féin circles, that when it came to adopting a form of PR for the fledgling state, the Sinn Féin deputies simply went along with Griffith's choice of STV. No other alternative was discussed, simply because the Dáil wasn't aware of any other alternative. Hence, to this day, the voting system in Ireland is referred to as PR. People do not know what STV is. They think it's some kind of transmissible virus, which explains why even the original Free State Constitution of 1922 did not refer to STV, it referred to PR. So, to this day, because we've had the system for 90 years, whenever electoral reform is considered, as is currently the case, incidentally, if you are interested in this whole area about political reform, academics set up this website called politicalreform.ie, whereby it's like a blog of Irish political academics. Just go on, debate all the various issues, from do we need a new electoral system, should we drop the Seanad, and so on. So, as said at the moment, electoral and political reform is a topical issue. whenever it comes up, STV is often seen as a cherished and innately Irish system that suits the country's political culture. You know, you're voting for someone who, you know where they live, you live in their address, you know their face, you know their occupation. So people link the culture and the particular ballot. However, like so many other apparent core aspects of a country's makeup, the electoral system was simply the product of historical chance and could just as easily have been a different system had Arthur Griffith met a different scholar of electoral systems. Ireland, of course, was not the first country to use the single transferable vote. The first parliament elected under this method was the Tasmanian House of Assembly, although they don't call it STV. Rather, it is known as Hare-Clark, which is a homage to its creator, Thomas Hare, and author Andrew Inglis Clark, the state's Attorney General, who introduced it to Tasmania. At the federal level, Australia did not shift to preferential voting until 1918, when the alternative vote was adopted for the House of Representative elections. And as I've mentioned already, in 1949 then, this system was adopted for the federal Senate. But what's interesting looking at the links between Ireland and Australia is that debates on electoral reform largely took place entirely independent of each other. Unlike the Irish case, however, of historical accident, the Australian shift to preferential voting had a deliberate intention in mind. For example, the first move to the current alternative vote in the Federal House of Representatives in 1918 was simply a deal to prevent the minority Labour Party from profiting from a split in the Conservative vote between the Nationalist and Country parties. So too, the Chifley Labour government changed the Senate's voting system to STV in 1948 to minimise the expected electoral victories of the Liberals' new leader, Robert Menzies. Another factor that distinguishes the Australian from the Irish experience is the role of some key experts in the adoption of the electoral system in Australia. Many key actors played a role in promoting preferential voting, including in particular Edward Nansen, known as the expert's expert, one of the founders of social choice theory. That said, getting academics involved in the policy-making process may not always be an expedient process. For example, on being exhausted from the differing advice of electoral system specialists in Parliament, one Australian senator remarked, "Mr. Droop disagrees with Mr. Hare, and somebody comes along and disagrees with Mr. Droop. Miss Spence then disagrees with them, and Professor Nansen disagrees with the lot. Then Professor Ashworth sweeps the whole lot aside and say they are all wrong." That's probably why we've been ignored back in Ireland. So what have been the consequences of this system? There have been many consequences of electoral systems. I just want to focus on two. The first is its contribution to the nature of political competition, in particular the calibre of the parliamentarian, and then the effect this can have on the economy. The second then is the presence of independence. I mentioned in the title the lessons we can learn from the Irish experience. As I said, there's this growing attitude amongst the Irish commentariat that the reason for the economic mess is not Lehman's Bank, it's not the euro, it's not what the Greeks have done and so on, it's actually down to this thing. It's down to the voting system. Now the argument simply is that, well, because it encourages intra-party competition, the claim is that because people are voting for candidates of the same party, because in Ireland, when party incumbents lose their seat, they're more likely to lose the seat to someone from the same party than to someone from the opposition. So the greatest enemy is apparently their friend. So as a result, if you're a Fianna Fáil politician, your main rival is your fellow Fianna Fáil running mate. The argument is then, when you go canvassing and so on, you cannot campaign apparently on policy or ideology because you're supposed to have the same policy or same ideology, or you're supposed to have the same lack of policy, or whatever you want to believe. So then the only thing apparently that you're able to compete in is on what we call personalism and localism, i.e. your own personality, what you can do for the local area. So maybe you can fix more potholes, maybe you can get more bridges filled and so on. So the argument then goes, as a result, we have elected to the Irish Parliament essentially parish pump politicians, pothole fixers. And as a result, we have people who can't make proper financial economic policy. This is the argument. So, and as a result, this led to the economic crash, or the mess. So from this system, which induces a certain type of behaviour, we have what are called messenger boy politicians, which brings about, which leads to a parliament which in effect has no real power. The Irish government and the Irish Prime Minister, is from a comparative basis, is one of the most powerful parliaments in the Western world. And there was a ranking done of Prime Ministers, and I think only the Icelandic Prime Minister had more power than the Taoiseach. In terms of the powers to actually call meetings, in terms of if they're able to push their policy agenda through, and so on. Now, so the argument is in Ireland, there's a quote from a former Trinity professor, Basil Chubb, who described the main job of politicians in Ireland is to go about persecuting civil servants. Or as former Labour TD Jim Kimmy colourfully described, act like mighty mouse in their own parish, but like a church mouse in the Dáil. Indeed, in 1998, a commission in Britain on reform of the voting system noted that, quote, STV in Ireland has turned out to be a system more suited to the style of a good local councillor becoming a TD than to that of Daniel O'Connell or Charles Stewart Parnell. So to summarise, Ireland is said, STV in Ireland is said to have produced parliamentarians for whom, to paraphrase former British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, the country is nothing, it is the constituency that matters. As a consequence, while the local constituency may keep its hospital and acquire a casino, the country falls to rack and ruin. However, disappointingly and perhaps not surprisingly, few of the detractors of STV have considered the comparative experience of both STV and the quality of parliamentarians. To begin with, there is no logical basis to the claim that candidates of the same party cannot compete in anything other than brokerage services, because there are usually quite clear differences between candidates of the same party. Second, constituency-based politics, or brokerage, was around for a long time prior to the introduction of STV. Third, it's also quite prevalent in systems that do not use STV. Fourth, there is quite a considerable variation in the level of constituency work carried out by MPs in other European countries using a preferential electoral system. Fifth, the Dáil is weak for a number of other reasons, most of which are independent of STV, and it's unlikely that electoral reform would increase the power of the Dáil and thus save the Irish economy. In any case, while the greater emphasis on constituency matters might seem a pattern of representation far removed from Edmund Burke's ideal of a national parliament, quote, where not the local purposes, not local prejudices ought to guide, but the general good, resulting from the general reason of the whole, we should be wary of assuming that there is a specific normative role for parliamentarians. No prescriptive reference is made to this in any article of any constitution or any item of legislation in any parliament. It is also not particularly clear what politicians would do if they didn't carry out their brokerage duties like filling potholes and so on. There is certainly no evidence that they would spend more time in Parliament. Indeed, prior to the 1960s, when excessive brokerage was not a major burden on TDs' time, the additional free hours were usually spent on their careers outside of politics, not in the Dáil. For example, a former leader of Fine Gael, the leader of the opposition, he used to spend his spare time serving in his department store back home in Balladurin in Mayo, which wasn't even his home constituency. So I mentioned people who detract STV don't look at the comparative experience. They don't look at Australia. Well, the claim in Australia is that STV in Australia should not, in terms of how it's used at the Senate elections, should not produce the Irish-type messenger boy politicians. This is because of the modifications made to the STV ballot since 1983. This is best showed by, obviously, visual means. So this, if you read the rules, it's pretty much the same system as the Irish ballot, but they have tinkered with the system. For those of you who voted here, of course, it's compulsory here, so most of you probably have. You know, this on the ballot is, the idea is, you can vote above the line. If you vote above the line, you only need to cast a 1 for the Tasmanian Senate team if you want. So each party, it's usually party names across the top, and they list the candidates down below. If you vote below the line, so the only reason why you'd want to vote below the line is if you don't agree with the order of candidates. Because as you can imagine, if you know, let's say, the Liberals are going to get 30% of the votes, they're going to be guaranteed, let's say, 4 out of 15 seats, which means the first 4 of their candidates are going to be elected. Now, maybe you don't like the first 4, because maybe you think these are just party hacks. So you can alter the order. But to alter the order, you must go below the line. Once you go below the line, you must cast a preference for every candidate. Now, that's a pretty nice ballot paper. There have been ballot papers that have 300-400 candidates. I got students to test this out. If you just write down 1 to 300 as fast as possible, without even looking at names, it takes you about 12, 13 minutes. So, you know, 95% of people vote above the line. So, I mean, that has a consequence for especially independents. The consequence is it's a party-centred system. The consequence is it's much more like the Hungarian system. It's actually, yeah.
Oh, sorry. You have Brian Harrody. He's there in Springfield isolation, above and below the line.
Yeah. He managed to see, because of the influence he wielded in the federal Senate, he managed to get them to change the legislation whereby if you are an incumbent, you can go above the line.
Oh, but only if you're an incumbent.
If only for an incumbent, yeah. And that was that's just a Brian Harradine rule, yeah. Yeah. But when he first ran, see, of course, when he first ran, this above the line only came in 1983. He first ran, I think, in the 70s as an independent, when there was no line. So he got in before the line. Once he introduced the line, he said, please change the rule to suit me.
It's a wonderful thing, the balance of power.
Indeed, yeah. And I'm going to talk about independence in a moment. So have the variations in the single transferable vote in Australia, has this produced a different calibre of politician in Australia than Ireland? Now, it's difficult to provide, obviously, a reliable and valid measure of the quality of parliamentarians, but what is certain is that if calibre was measured by the esteem with which they are held by voters, there isn't a great deal of difference between the two countries. Irish and Australian voters are no different to any national electorate in terms of the disdain they exhibit towards their politicians. Indeed, what impact has this had on the fortunes of the Australian economy? Well, when the Australian Senate first adopted the single transferable vote in 1949, no critics cited potential future economic crashes as a result of this change. No one blames STV for Tasmania's economic underdevelopment. In fact, it could actually be argued that it was the very presence of STV which resulted in the election of Brian Harradine, which actually had a positive effect on the Tasmanian economy, simply because of the balance of power that he held. Similarly, no one at the moment is discussing the role of the electoral system in causing and maintaining the current Australian economic boom, the causes of which literally run a lot deeper. Now, so the final thing I want to talk about, and I just touched on it already, in relation to the consequences, and it's a paper I have coming out, and I presented it last month at the Australian Political Studies Association conference, is the argument that the single transferable vote produces independent parliamentarians. This is the image you have of independence. A few cartoons from Ireland and Australia. Very much seen as a kind of anachronistic presence, an idea of a time gone past, when you didn't have political parties, when all politics is local. The chap in the tux, you might recognise, if you know about Irish politics, is Jackie Healy-Rae. He held the balance of power just like Tony Windsor and so on holds now. In fact, this was a lot more crucial because they held the balance of power when we needed a loan from the International Monetary Fund. So the budget had to be passed, but the budget can only be passed if several of the independents, such as this individual, agree to support them. Now, I've looked at the numbers. There are very few independents in most Western democracies. The few in Australia is certainly an exception. In Ireland, we've always had independents. We're the only parliament that has always had an independent presence. At the moment, in a parliament of 166, we have 15 independent politicians. In 2002, there were 13 and so on. So it's quite unusual. And in fact, the single transferable vote is the only form of proportional representation under which independents get elected. Now, there's a lot of negative press, as you can see from this cartoon. This is one of the main reasons why I came to Australia. I wanted to look at the influence independents had in Australian politics and the attitudes towards them. Because as I said, up until the last century, parties were seen as anathema to democracy. They were seen as distorting the ideas of the voters. So the independent was cherished as the true type of politician we should have in democracy, and the wheel seems to have turned full circle. So I wanted to compare what's going on, because everyone who studies the single transferable vote system, those of us who do, I say looks at Ireland. And when they look at the Irish scene, they see all these independents. We have this situation like you had at the recent election with these independents holding the balance of power, commanding the two main parties. We've had this on on 40% of occasions. So almost every second election in Ireland, we've had this kind of situation. So people have said it's the fault of the single transferable voting system. So I just looked at a few other English-speaking countries. This is the total number of independent parliamentarians since 1945 in these particular countries. So I think I have the proportions written down. So, for example, Ireland has had 59 times the proportion of independents elected in Britain, 32 times the number elected in the US, 10 times those in Canada, 77 times the proportion in New Zealand. Well, there's only been one independent in New Zealand, and he wasn't really an independent. That was Winston Peters. But not just that. The reason I was interested was because as early as 1913, a justice of the Supreme Court in Ireland warned about the danger of independent members holding the balance of power, something that was quite evident during the 1981-2 period when independents in Ireland contributed to the fall of 2 successive governments, resulting in 3 general elections in 18 months. Now, the reason why people claim it results in, I'll show you the ballot, the argument is that, first of all, it encourages you to think about candidates. So when you think about candidates, party is not as important. So maybe the argument is independents have more of an even platform against parties. Also, I said, apparently the nature of the ballot produces the kind of parish pump politics. Now, anyone can participate in parish pump politics. You don't need a party label to participate in parish pump politics because you're competing on what your name and your personality can deliver for the locality. So again, you're not at a major disadvantage as an independent. Another reason also is because you don't need, people don't waste their vote by voting for an independent. You can give an independent your first preference, but then give it also a party candidate your second preference. So this encourages sincere as opposed to, let's say, strategic voting, which occurs under the British system. Now, the argument that this is supposed to produce independence has split the political science community, largely because when you consider the case of Australia, and I have some stats here and some numbers. This shows the number of independents elected at the federal level and the state level in Australia. The only independents who get elected, excuse me, tend to be in lower houses, which uses the alternative vote. Under the single transferable vote, there are almost no independents. New South Wales has never had an independent in their state upper house. They use STV, of course. They use that modified party list type of STV. Victoria's had none. Western Australia has had 1. South Australia has had 3. That's Nick Xenophon and one of his mates. And I totaled them all up, and since 1950 in Australia, 42 independents have been elected under STV and 355 under the alternative vote. So if you look at again, I mentioned how the reasons for why the preferential voting was adopted in Ireland and Australia occurred quite independent of each other, occurred for different reasons, and also their consequences have been quite different. They've had different effects on the nature of the party system and different effects on the nature of the political competition, which also throws into light then when people claim, look, the electoral system is responsible for all your ills. You really kind of need to reevaluate, well, hold on, how really influential is the particular electoral system? So while these differences between the design of STV in Ireland and Australia might explain why independents' future electoral prospects are bleak, it doesn't explain why independents really haven't fared that well. Okay, even in the federal house, they've started to win a few seats now with Andrew Wilkie, Tony Windsor and so on, but that is a very recent, that's only a very recent occurrence. Before the mid-90s, when Pauline Hanson broke through, when Peter Andren also got elected, there were no independents. So there must be other reasons aside from the particular electoral system. Now, the reason why I mentioned the independents largely was because establishing the true nature of the link between STV and independence is important because the presence of independents, as I said, is generally frowned upon because they're deemed to erode transparency and accountability, undermine the stability of party and parliamentary democracy. So whatever the exact cause of independent success in Ireland and the lack of in Australia, it's not just the electoral system. So those opposed to or in favour of preferential voting, because of its apparent conduciveness for independence, need to re-evaluate their opinion of this electoral system. So just to conclude my talk, what can we learn from the... Yeah?
Just clarification.
Sure.
Tasmania stands out in that list in my mind as the outlier. What's the reason that Tasmania and none of the other states have such a huge number in the upper house?
They've never...
Can you clarify that?
Sure. They've never had a general election for the upper house. They have staggered elections. There's 15 members, so every year 2 or 3 are elected. So I think it goes 2-2, 2-2-2, and then 3-3. So they've never had a general election. So sometimes there are incumbents who are unopposed. The parties, it claims to be the only parliament in the world that has never been controlled by political parties. Now, other people tell me that the independents in there are actually quasi-independents. But and also, it's the only elections in Australia that have campaign limits, so you cannot spend more than $13,000. So again, this prevents the parties from spending large amounts to promote themselves. But if you've been in Tasmania during a upper house election, there's no coverage. So there's only 2 seats up for office each year. There's no talk about it. The incumbent gets re-elected. Parties just kind of stay clear of it. So yeah, it's a pretty unusual case. I think largely because they've never had a general election whereby all seats are up for contest at the one time.
Surely you've indirectly answered the question yourself. You commented on the size of the voting electorate.
Yeah.
And in Ireland you've got what I would describe as the intimacy of the electorate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean...
A much smaller country, a much smaller
Yeah.
population.
I mean, for example...
Intimacy there.
Yeah.
Don't have in this huge.
No, I mean, for example, New South Wales, the quota to get elected is 5%. I say 4%. So you only need 4% of the vote to win a seat in the upper house in New South Wales. You would imagine you would have loads of independents. But the point is, the constituency is the entire state. So I think the size of New South Wales is about 1 million square kilometres. Similarly, in South Australia, it's a pretty low quota as well. But again, it's a massive area. That's why the independents who get elected actually do under the single seat constituency. So Peter Andren won because his area in Calarea was only 40,000 voters. If he had ran for the Senate, I doubt he'd have got elected. And that's why, and the only problem is with that, and that's why I haven't discussed one country, is Malta. Because Malta actually uses the single transferable vote. It's a very close-knit political culture. It's got the purest 2-party system in the world. There are only 2 parties. People only vote for 2 parties. And it doesn't have compulsory voting, but everyone votes. But again, it's got the purest 2-party system. If you've been there for an election, they don't compete on party label. They just put up their photograph. And it's worse than Ireland. The posters are absolutely everywhere. So Malta just breaks all the rules, and that's why everyone ignores Malta. And unfortunately, for funding purposes, Malta is included as part of Greece by the EU. I'd applied for funding last year to go to Malta, and it got turned down because they said we don't fund any Greek-related projects. And so I'm sure, I don't know when Malta became part of Greece, but apparently so. So, just to conclude this talk, well, I suppose what we can learn from this, comparing the Irish and Australian experience of this system, is a danger of reaching conclusions from single case studies. Because as I said, the single transferable vote appears to have had different consequences in the 2 countries. It could also mean that more attention needs to be paid to the details of the electoral system, since as was shown, the 2 systems are not exactly the same, particularly since the changes made to the Senate in Australia. So maybe it's the case that the Irish and Australian politicians are not of the highest calibre, but which country's politicians are deemed to be? Do we place impossible standards on our politicians, who, after all, are a reflection of the country in which they are elected? Whatever the reason for the nature of the parliamentarians in both countries, it runs far deeper than the electoral rules. Those hoping that electoral reform in Ireland will result in a golden age of Parliament should not hold their breath. The point is, those wishing to blame the electoral system for a country's ills are most likely putting forward the wrong answer to the right question. They are right to be interested in the nature of the relationship between electoral rules and a political system, but they should be wary of promoting further change. The Australian economy does not owe its success to the decision of the House of Representatives to choose the alternative vote over the single transferable vote. Neither is Wayne Swan likely to believe that he was named the world's best treasurer simply because they used STV for the upper house. Equally, in the Irish case, STV did not cause the Celtic Tiger. Likewise, it should not be blamed for its collapse. Electoral rules matter, but we need to be wholly clear how they matter before tampering with them. Electoral reform might not be the equivalent of opening Pandora's box, but it can result in undesirable consequences. Just ask the previously mentioned British historians. Thank you.